the great, awesome, wonderful gift from Tennessee and Los Angeles, now in Alabama. Please welcome Kerry Madden.
Well, I just want to thank Jake for inviting me to be here today. We just literally last week just drove cross country. Nora, our daughter, started Homewood Middle School on Monday, so we've had this whole adventure. I grew up in football and moved all the time. My father was he coached for the Volunteers, and he coached for Mississippi State. He coached for Wake Forest, and he made a big impression on my life because he said, "I'm following my dream. This is my dream. You'll get your dream later." And I didn't like to move. I did not like moving around. He'd say, "There's no discussion. Get in the car. You're part of this team." And so he sort of instilled in me, this sense of but I didn't know I wasn't a jock and I wasn't a cheerleader, so I never knew where I fit in that world. So I would always bring a stack of novels to the football games, and I read and read and read, and I also was the oldest of 4 kids, and so I babysat a lot, and I would have to. I would have them act out stories, whatever I was reading. If I was, reading Oliver Twist, they had to be orphans and eat gruel, or they had to play. But anyway, so I grew up and I started writing. Started off in journalism, and then I moved into playwriting. And I actually met my husband, and I asked him, "How many kids do you have, or how many brothers and sisters do you have?" And he said, "I'm one of 13 children." And I thought, if I marry this man, I am never going to run out of stories. That's been the case. And so my trilogy was inspired by his family, which is, about a Smoky Mountain family in Maggie Valley. And after I was finished writing the trilogy, well, actually, my first book was called Offsides, growing up in the world of college football and being kind of, that whole world. And then there was like a long dry spell of what do I write next, because as a writer you're always trying to think what can you write, or what's going to be the next thing. And then I began to write the Maggie Valley books, and then after the Maggie Valley books, my editor at Viking, who's this wonderful editor, Catherine, she said, "Would you, I heard that there was a biography series," and she said, "Would you like to write one?" And I said, "I would, very much so." And I had told my agent, I said, I want to write one of those biographies. I think I could do that. And she said, "Well, Catherine said, what about Harper Lee? Would you like to write Harper Lee?" And I thought, it was like somebody had given me a gift. And I said, "Yes, please let me do it, please." I was like, "You don't even have to pay me, just let me do it, please let me do it." And so I called my sister, we worked it out, we got my agent, got on board, and then I wrote to Miss Lee, and I said, "I'd like to, this is a biography for teens. I want to, I do a lot of writing workshops in school. I try to help kids learn to write their stories." And I sort of told her, but she wrote back and she said, "I don't believe in biographies for those still living, and I may be old, but I'm still breathing. However, I wish you the best whether you pursue it or not." So I took that, "I wish you the best whether you pursue it or not," and I thought, I cannot sit in LA and Google Harper Lee. I have to go to Monroeville. So I called my sister, and I started off in Montgomery at the Alabama Book Festival, and I met with Wayne Greenhaw, a poet, and then Wayne Greenhaw said, "You got to meet Angela Roberts," and Angela Roberts said, "You got to meet Jane Ellen Clark," and Jane Ellen Clark said, "You got to meet George Thomas Jones." George, "You got to meet." And so one thing, so one thing led to another, and so we went to Monroeville, and my sister and I, we spent a week just interviewing folks, and sometimes the interviews would last. They'd go, you think you're going to go sort of on a schedule, okay, we're going to meet at 8, or we're going to meet at 9, or we're going to meet, but sometimes they'd last 3 hours, or they'd last, one interview lasted about 6 hours, because we met him at 5, A.B. Blast, this wonderful man. And so we met at the cafe, and then he took us on a tour of the courthouse and around the square. So you just sort of let go of any kind of, I'm on a time schedule. We didn't care about time. We just said, let the stories happen the way they're going to happen. And so that was how, and then we would go back to the hotel room, and we would begin to, I thought, well, I want to do it the way Truman and Nell did it in Kansas. They would transcribe at night, or they would write down all the notes at night. So we would go back, and we would, my sister was sort of like the back. She would say, okay, this is what I got, what did you get? And we would just compare notes. And then I had to go back. I went back a second time because I thought it wasn't enough. It wasn't long enough. And then did a bunch more interviews, and then went back a third time. And just because I just needed to, have that. I wanted it not to just be this biography that would be, phoned in or something that wasn't real. And I wanted it to be something that kids could really relate and see that how could a girl growing up in Alabama in the 30s, how did she grow up to be Harper Lee? And that kids, so since it is a book for teens, getting kids to tell their story and write their story. So that's a little bit of how I got it started. And then I'll tell you, somebody was saying that was just back here was saying how they're not a writer, but it's so much of it was revision. Like the second half of the book came together because I had there was so much, but the first half was like this big blob of childhood, and my editor said, "This is not working." and so I met with this biographer who writes these wonderful, Elizabeth Partridge. She's written biographies of John Lennon and oh my gosh, many. Who's the photographer?
Leibowitz?
Yes, she's written several. Dorothea Lange. I'm sorry, Dorothea Lange, because Elizabeth's father was friends with her. So, but I said, I said I'm in trouble, and she said, well, let's look at it. And so I was at a conference, and so we went, and she said, this is, because I thought, well, I could, because I had interviewed Jennings Carter, who was Big Boy, who was sort of the inspiration for Jem, I thought, well, I could sort of make up this little piece of dialogue in the backyard where they're playing in the treehouse, and Elizabeth goes, did they say that? And I said, well, no, but they were. She goes, you take that out now. You will be crucified if you put it. And it was like suddenly this laser. I thought, because my editor had been saying it's got to read like fiction, but it's like not that much like fiction. And so I really I thought, okay, so I just began to shape the stories of childhood. And the interviews that I did, like I interviewed the mayor, who has since passed away. And so she, Anne Farish, and she told me so many stories, like studying the cracks in the sidewalk looking for nickels to buy a Mr. Goodbar, or having her dog named Big Shot follow her to school. A meeting, just the stories of talking with Jennings Carter in the talking about the games they'd play, or the desserts. We talked. Just tell me about your childhood. Tell me about, and he would say how Truman would always, steal he'd always swap the butter beans, so he looked like they were all peeling the beans, and Truman would grab all the handfuls, so it looked like he had done the most. And he always had to play the school teacher when they would play school on pieces of stove wood in the backyard, and Truman always had to be the teacher so he could crack them with a stick if they got the wrong answer. So it was just like story after story that became sort of this tapestry, and I thought, okay, how can I shape this and how can I shape that? And that was how the book began, just through storytelling, which is, I think how Harper Lee talks about, when we were young, we grew up, we didn't have television. There was, we had to make up stories. We acted out stories in books and in the backyard, and didn't you ever become, a sailor or a pirate, and so I tried to imagine how a kid would see the world at that age, and so that was a little bit of how I began to write the book. But I thought I would open it up to questions, and then talk a little bit more about the second half of the book. Does anybody have any questions?